The city was alive, but Daniel felt like a ghost drifting through its streets. The neon lights of nearby cafes and bars reflected in puddles on the cracked pavement, their warmth teasing him with a life he no longer belonged to. The air smelled of fried food and expensive perfume, but beneath it lingered the stench of garbage, damp concrete, and the unmistakable scent of desperation. A cold wind cut through his tattered coat as he pulled his knees closer to his chest, trying to preserve whatever little warmth remained in his body. It had been another long day of being ignored, another day of empty stomach aches, and another night of battling the thought that had been gnawing at him for weeks. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the end. He had been sitting outside the same coffee shop for hours, watching people come and go, their conversations filled with meaningless complaints. Someone's coffee was too hot. Another person was frustrated that their order took longer than expected. These problems used to be his, back when he was just another man with a job, a home, and a future. Now, his problems had been reduced to the weight of the single coin in his palm, barely enough to buy anything, and the realization that even if he disappeared tonight, no one would notice. No one would care. The cold was worse than hunger. It seeped into his bones, made his limbs stiff and unresponsive, and dulled his thoughts until he could barely remember what warmth felt like. He adjusted his coat again, the fabric thinning in places where the seams had given up. His breath came out in visible puffs, disappearing into the void of a city that had long since turned its back on him. Once, he had been part of this world. He had walked these streets with purpose, dressed in tailored suits, making calls, shaking hands, building something. Now he was nothing more than a shadow people avoided, another faceless figure in a society that did not care about those who fell behind. A group of college students walked past him, their laughter cutting through the silence of his isolation. One of them glanced his way, a flicker of pity flashing across her face before she turned back to her friends, quickly forgetting he existed. He had lost count of how many times people had done that. Some dropped coins into his cup, others muttered a quick "God bless you," as if that would fix everything. But most just ignored him, as if looking at him would remind them that this could happen to anyone, that once he had been just like them. The weight in his chest tightened as he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, crumpled photograph. His fingers, numb and shaking, traced the edges as he stared at the faded image. His wife, Emily, smiling brightly, their daughter Lily perched on his shoulders, her tiny hands clutching his hair as she laughed. The memory felt like a lifetime ago, back when he had a home, back when he mattered. He should throw the picture away. Holding on to it was pointless. The man in that photo no longer existed. But no matter how many times he told himself to let go, he could not. It was the only proof that once he had been more than this. The night grew colder, and his body felt heavier. His stomach had long since stopped growling, accepting that food was not coming. He leaned back against the brick wall, letting his eyes drift shut, the exhaustion pulling at him like a tide. If he fell asleep and never woke up, would it really matter? Just as his mind began to slip into that dangerous space between sleep and surrender, the sound of a car door shutting made his eyes snap open. He had heard that sound 1,000,000 times before. Expensive cars stopping at the curb, well-dressed people stepping out, going about their lives without a second glance in his direction. It never concerned him. It was never about him. Until now. He heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate. He ignored them at first, assuming they would pass by like everyone else. But they did not. The footsteps stopped right in front of him. Reluctantly, Daniel lifted his gaze, expecting another cop telling him to move or a well-meaning stranger offering scraps of food he would refuse out of pride. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Standing before him, hands in the pockets of an expensive overcoat, was Bill Gates. Daniel blinked, convinced for a moment that his hunger and exhaustion had finally made him hallucinate. But no, it was really him, the billionaire. The man whose name was spoken in boardrooms and financial networks around the world. The man who had built an empire with his mind and ambition. The last person Daniel ever expected to be standing before a homeless man on a freezing night. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city noise seemed to fade, leaving just the two of them in an eerie silence. Then Bill crouched down, bringing himself to Daniel's level, and asked, "How long have you been out here?" Daniel blinked again, thrown off by the question. He expected something else, maybe a forced smile and a polite nod before walking away. But Bill Gates was looking at him with something he had not seen in a long time: genuine interest. He swallowed, his throat dry, his voice rusty from days without real conversation. Too long. Bill studied him, as if trying to piece together a puzzle no one else had bothered to solve. "What is your name?" Daniel hesitated. He could have lied, could have ignored the question entirely. But something about the way Bill asked made him answer before he could stop himself. "Daniel." Bill nodded, as if locking the name into his mind. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached into his coat pocket. Daniel tensed, expecting him to pull out a wad of cash or a check like most rich people did when they wanted to ease their conscience. He prepared to refuse it, because money did not change anything. It did not bring back what he had lost. But Bill did not hand him money. Instead, he pulled out a small, folded piece of paper and extended it toward him. Daniel frowned, his fingers hesitating before taking it. The paper was thick, expensive, not something people handed out lightly. He slowly unfolded it, his heart pounding as he read the words written inside. "Meet me here tomorrow morning. Let us talk. Bill." Daniel stared at the note, reading it over and over as if the meaning would change. His mind raced with questions. Why? What does he want? Why would a billionaire care about a man like me? His eyes lifted to Bill, searching for answers. Why? The word came out rough, almost accusing. Bill's gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. Then, he simply said, "Because I believe in second chances." And just like that, he stood up, adjusted his coat, and walked away, leaving Daniel sitting there with the note clutched tightly in his shaking hands. For the first time in years, he felt something other than emptiness. For the first time in years, someone had seen him. And for the first time in years, he did not know what to do next. Daniel sat on the cold pavement, gripping the folded note in his numb fingers, his breath coming out in uneven puffs. The words on the paper played over and over in his mind like a broken record. "Meet me here tomorrow morning. Let us talk. Bill." He had reread it at least 50 times, tracing the ink with the tip of his thumb as if the texture would somehow reveal the hidden meaning behind it. His heart wanted to believe that this was real, that Bill Gates had genuinely meant what he said. But his mind, hardened by years of disappointment, told him otherwise. People with money did not stop for people like him. The rich did not waste their time on the forgotten. This had to be a mistake, a joke, a fleeting moment of pity that would fade with the morning light. And yet, he had not let go of the note. That alone terrified him. He had spent years training himself not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope made the fall even harder when reality came crashing back. And yet, here he was, clinging to a flimsy piece of paper as if it were a lifeline. He pressed his forehead against his knees, trying to drown out the noise of the city around him. He could hear the distant honking of cars, the chatter of early morning commuters, the rhythmic tapping of hurried footsteps against the pavement. The world was moving forward, oblivious to the man frozen in place, trapped between his past and an uncertain future. He wanted to tear up the note, to throw it away and pretend it had never existed, but he could not. Something inside him would not let him. The night was long and merciless. He barely slept, his body stiff from the cold, his thoughts waging war in his mind. By the time the sky began to lighten, turning from deep black to a dull shade of gray, his decision had still not been made. His stomach twisted with hunger, but he barely noticed. The hunger had become a part of him now, a dull ache that never fully disappeared. What gnawed at him more was the weight of the decision pressing down on his chest. Go to the meeting, or stay here, in the life he had resigned himself to. It should have been an easy choice. Staying was familiar, predictable, safe in a twisted way. He knew how to survive out here, even if survival meant nothing more than existing. But what if Bill actually showed up? The thought alone sent a wave of anxiety through him. What if this was not a joke? What if, for the first time in years, someone actually saw him, really saw him? The idea was almost more terrifying than the alternative. He had spent so long fading into the background that the thought of being pulled back into the world felt foreign. But the question that kept repeating in his mind, the one he could not ignore no matter how hard he tried, was even more unsettling. What if this was his only chance? What if walking away meant staying on these streets forever? The thought made his pulse quicken. He had been waiting for something to change for so long. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was his moment. With shaky hands, he pushed himself up, his joints protesting from the hours spent sitting on the freezing pavement. He ran a hand through his tangled hair, straightened his coat, and took a deep breath. His feet felt heavy as he took the first step forward, as if his body was still unsure about his decision. The street stretched out in front of him, a path he had walked 1,000 times before. Yet today, it felt different. The city had always been a reminder of what he had lost, but today, it felt like it was offering him something, a choice. He arrived at the meeting spot early, his hands stuffed into his coat pockets as he rocked back and forth on his heels. The anticipation gnawed at him, making every passing second feel like an eternity. Every black car that drove by made his pulse jump, only for disappointment to settle in when none of them stopped. He could hear the doubt creeping back in, whispering in his ear that he was a fool for believing in something as ridiculous as this. People like Bill Gates did not waste their time on people like him. He should turn around. He should walk away before he embarrassed himself. But then, at exactly 9 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. His breath caught in his throat as the back door opened and out stepped Bill Gates. He looked exactly the same as the night before, composed, deliberate, like a man who never did anything without a purpose. There was no hesitation in his movements as he approached Daniel, carrying a small white paper bag in one hand and a takeaway coffee cup in the other. He held out the coffee first. "I did not know how you take it," he said, his voice as calm and even as ever. "So, I got black. You can add sugar if you want." For a moment, Daniel did not move. He just stared at the cup, his mind struggling to process what was happening. People did not buy him coffee. They did not stop to talk to him. They did not look at him as if he were worth their time. Slowly, he reached out and took the cup, the warmth seeping through his frozen fingers. The scent of coffee filled his nose, rich and bitter, and for a moment, he just held it, savoring the feeling of something that felt almost normal. Bill motioned toward a nearby bench, and without waiting for a response, he sat down. After another brief hesitation, Daniel followed. The silence stretched between them as they sat side by side sipping their coffee. Daniel expected Bill to speak first, to launch into some lecture about hard work and perseverance. But he did not. He just sat there, as if giving Daniel the space to decide how this conversation would go. Eventually, Daniel broke the silence. "Why me?" His voice came out rough, laced with skepticism and exhaustion. "Out of all the people in this city, why stop for me?" Bill exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the steam rising from his cup. "Because I believe in second chances." The words were simple, but they carried weight. He turned to look at Daniel, his eyes steady, searching. "Do you?" Daniel scoffed. "People like me do not get second chances." Bill studied him for a moment before reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. He placed it on the bench between them. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Meet me at this address." His voice was calm, unwavering. "If you want a second chance, be there." Daniel stared at the paper as if it might disappear. His hands twitched, but he did not reach for it. He wanted to. God, he wanted to. But the fear of hope, of believing in something only to watch it slip through his fingers, made his body tense. He clenched his jaw, his thoughts warring against each other. Bill stood up, adjusting his coat. "The choice is yours." He did not wait for a response. He simply turned and walked back toward the car. The door shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the paper as if it held the answer to every question he had ever asked. His fingers hovered over it, hesitant, unsure. He had a choice to make, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the choice was actually his. Daniel stood outside the massive glass building, gripping the folded paper in his hand. The weight of the past years sat heavy on his shoulders, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar: hesitation. His entire existence had been shaped by survival, by waking up and making it through just one more day, never expecting anything beyond that. Now he was here, standing before an opportunity that seemed too unreal to be true. His worn-out boots scuffed against the clean pavement as he looked at the entrance. Everything about this place screamed that he did not belong. The people walking past him were polished, moving with purpose, each one dressed in expensive coats and clean shoes, their expressions focused, as if the world was waiting for them. No one looked twice at him, but that was nothing new. For years he had been invisible, a shadow lingering in the forgotten corners of the city. The glass doors slid open, and Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. He should turn around. He should walk away before someone tells him he does not belong here. But before he could convince himself to leave, a familiar black car pulled up beside the curb. The back door opened and Bill Gates stepped out, adjusting the sleeves of his navy blue coat. His expression remained unreadable, the same calm, collected demeanor he had the night before. Without a moment's hesitation, he turned towards Daniel, his sharp eyes meeting his own. There was no judgment in them, no sign of second thoughts. He simply gestured towards the entrance and said, "Shall we?" The words were spoken so casually, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. Daniel swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper in his pocket. His body screamed at him to run, to disappear back into the familiarity of the streets. But a part of him, small, fragile, but desperate, wanted to see where this would lead. Stepping inside felt like crossing into another world. The warmth hit him instantly, making him realize just how cold he had been outside. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the damp, musty scent of the streets he had become accustomed to. The floor beneath him was pristine, polished marble that reflected the soft overhead lights. People moved through the lobby, their conversations a low hum of business meetings and daily agendas. A few of them glanced his way, their eyes flickering with curiosity before shifting back to whatever they were doing. No one stopped him. No one asked him to leave. That alone was unsettling. Bill led him down a quiet hallway away from the crowd. The sound of their footsteps echoed lightly as they reached a private room. The space was modern but not intimidating. Just a simple wooden table with 2 chairs, a coffee pot placed neatly in the center. It was not an office. It was not a shelter. It was something else entirely. Bill motioned for him to sit, and Daniel hesitated for only a second before lowering himself onto the chair. The warmth of the room settled into his bones, making him acutely aware of how exhausted he truly was. He had not felt this kind of comfort in years, and it scared him. His entire life had been defined by discomfort, by struggle, by always being on edge. Sitting here across from one of the richest men in the world felt like stepping into someone else's reality. Bill poured them both a cup of coffee, sliding one toward Daniel without a word. The rich aroma filled the air, and Daniel hesitated before wrapping his fingers around the cup. It was hot, the heat seeping into his cold hands, grounding him in the moment. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and uncertainty. Daniel knew why he was here. He just did not understand why Bill had brought him. Finally, Bill leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping against the table in a rhythmic motion. "I am not here to offer you charity," he said, his tone measured but firm. "I do not believe in handouts." Daniel stiffened at the words, his grip on the cup tightening. He should have known. Of course, this was not about helping him. It was about something else. A test. A lesson. A reminder that he was nothing but a statistic. Another cautionary tale. But before he could react, Bill continued, "I believe in second chances, but only if someone is willing to take them." His gaze was steady, unwavering. It was not pity. It was something else. Something Daniel could not quite place. A dry chuckle escaped Daniel's lips, bitterness creeping into his voice. "Second chances," he echoed. "People like me do not get those." His tone was sharp, filled with years of disappointment and rejection. He had stopped believing in second chances the day his life fell apart. Bill did not flinch. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "That is where you are wrong." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "Inside this folder is an opportunity," he said. "A place to stay, a rehabilitation program, job training, a real shot at rebuilding your life." Daniel stared at the folder as if it would disappear if he looked away. His throat felt tight, his heart pounding against his ribs. This was a joke, it had to be. Nothing in life was given this easily. There had to be a catch. His fingers itched to grab the folder, but fear held him back. "Why me?" The question came out hoarse, uncertain. "Why would you waste your time on someone like me?" Bill leaned back in his chair, studying him carefully. "Because I see something in you," he said simply. "Something you have stopped seeing in yourself." The words hit harder than Daniel expected. For years, people had only seen him as a failure, a lost cause. No one had ever looked at him and seen anything worth saving. He had forgotten what it felt like to be believed in. His hands trembled as he reached for the folder, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. He could feel the weight of it, the reality of what was inside. "You do not have to decide right now," Bill continued. "But if you walk out of here without at least considering it, then you are making a choice too." His voice was calm, without pressure, but the meaning behind his words was clear. This was a crossroad, a moment where one decision could change everything. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent years waiting for something, anything, to pull him out of the pit he had fallen into. Now the chance was right in front of him. His fingers curled around the folder. His entire body tensed as if preparing for disappointment. But when he met Bill's gaze, something in his chest cracked open. He had spent too long running from hope, too long believing that his story had already ended. Maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. "I do not know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Bill's expression did not change. "I think you can," he said. "But it is your choice." The room was silent except for the faint hum of the city beyond the walls. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, inhaling deeply. The smell of coffee, the warmth of the room, the sound of his own heartbeat, reminding him that he was still alive. He exhaled slowly and opened his eyes. Then with a steady hand, he pulled the folder toward him. "I am in." Bill's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "Good." And just like that, everything changed. Daniel sat motionless on the bench, staring at the folded piece of paper in front of him. The city moved around him, people walking briskly past, taxis honking impatiently, the hum of conversations blending into the background. But he heard none of it. The address Bill Gates had given him sat like a weight on the wooden surface beside him, daring him to reach for it. He should not have hesitated. This was what he had wanted for so long. A way out, a second chance. And yet, his hands remained frozen in place, his body unwilling to make a move. It was almost laughable. He had survived years on the streets, endured hunger, cold, humiliation, and loss. But now, faced with a single decision, he was paralyzed with fear. It was not that he did not want to go. A part of him was desperate for change, but another part, the part that had been broken and beaten down over the years, whispered that it was all a lie, that showing up tomorrow would only lead to disappointment, that men like Bill Gates did not waste their time on nobodies like him. His mind waged war against itself, one side pushing him to grab the paper, to take the chance, while the other urged him to throw it away and forget it ever happened. For several long minutes he remained stuck in place, unable to move. Then, as if his body made the decision before his mind could catch up, his fingers twitched. Slowly, hesitantly, they closed around the folded paper. He picked it up and stuffed it into his coat pocket before he could change his mind. He exhaled shakily, as if the simple act of taking the note had taken all his strength. But it was done. He had made a decision. Now all that was left was to see it through. The night dragged on in agonizing slow motion. Sleep was impossible. He kept running through 100 different scenarios in his mind, each one worse than the last. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe when he arrived, no one would be there. Maybe it was some elaborate prank, and he would be laughed out of the building. The what-ifs tortured him, making every passing hour feel longer than the last. But despite his doubts, he did not leave. He stayed, fighting against the urge to run, against the instinct to retreat into the only life he had known for so long. Morning came too soon, the sky shifting from deep black to a pale shade of gray. Daniel's body was stiff, his limbs sore from another night on the pavement, but he barely noticed. His focus was locked on the task ahead. He had to get to the address. He had to see if this was real. With heavy steps, he walked through the streets, the city slowly waking up around him. He passed by familiar alleyways, places he had called home in the past, people who had once sat beside him in the same misery. The idea that he might actually be leaving all of this behind was terrifying. It felt wrong, like he was abandoning a part of himself. But if there was even a chance that things could change, he had to take it. He arrived at the address earlier than expected, standing in front of a modern building that looked out of place in his world. It was sleek, tall, made of glass and steel, the kind of place where important people worked and lives were shaped. He had never set foot in a place like this. His feet felt glued to the sidewalk, his body screaming at him to turn around, to leave before someone told him he did not belong. Before he could convince himself to walk away, a familiar black car pulled up beside him. The door opened, and Bill Gates stepped out, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto Daniel's hesitant form. There was no surprise on his face, no uncertainty. It was as if he had expected Daniel to show up all along. He nodded slightly, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, then motioned toward the entrance. "Come inside," he said simply. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to move, but his legs refused. Everything in him screamed that this was wrong, that he should not be here. He took a shaky breath, forcing himself to take a step forward, then another. Bill walked beside him, his pace steady, his presence oddly grounding. Inside, the warmth hit him immediately. It was the first time in years he had felt real, uninterrupted warmth. The air smelled clean, almost sterile, with hints of coffee lingering from somewhere nearby. The walls were bright, the floors polished, and the people walking through the halls moved with a sense of purpose he had not felt in a long time. They barely looked at him, too busy with their own lives, but even their indifference made him feel out of place. A woman at the front desk greeted them with a polite nod, her eyes briefly flickering to Daniel before she returned to her computer. No one asked him to leave. No one questioned why he was here. That alone was unsettling. Bill led him down a hallway, stopping outside a door before pushing it open. The room inside was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a small coffee station in the corner. It was not an office, not a shelter, just a space for conversation. Bill motioned for him to sit. Daniel hesitated for only a second before lowering himself into the chair, feeling painfully aware of his worn-out clothes against the pristine surroundings. Bill poured them both a cup of coffee, setting one in front of Daniel before sitting across from him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Bill spoke. "You made it." Daniel let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "I almost didn't." Bill studied him for a moment, then nodded as if he understood. "Change is terrifying." Daniel scoffed. "That's an understatement." Bill took a sip of his coffee before setting the cup down. "I won't lie to you, Daniel. This won't be easy. If you choose to move forward, there will be setbacks. There will be days where you'll want to give up." His gaze was steady, unwavering. "But I believe you can do this. The question is, do you?" Daniel stared at the steam rising from his cup, his mind tangled in a web of doubt. He had spent so long believing he was beyond saving. Now someone was telling him otherwise. He had no idea how to process that. "What if I fail?" The words slipped out before he could stop them. Bill's expression remained calm. "Then you get back up. That's what second chances are for." Daniel swallowed hard. His fingers curled around the cup, gripping it tightly. He wanted to believe this was possible. He wanted to believe in himself again. But years of disappointment had made that nearly impossible. Bill reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small card, placing it on the table. "This is the address of a rehabilitation center I personally founded. They'll help you get back on your feet. You'll have a roof over your head, meals, and a support system. But you have to be willing to put in the work." Daniel's chest tightened as he stared at the card. This was real. This was actually happening. He reached for it slowly, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. "You don't have to decide now," Bill continued. "But if you want this, be there tomorrow morning at 8. The weight of the choice settled over him. He looked up, meeting Bill's gaze. For the first time in years, someone was offering him a way out. Daniel's throat tightened. He exhaled shakily and gave a small nod. "I'll be there." Bill smiled slightly, nodding back. Everything had changed. Daniel walked through the city, the small card Bill Gates had given him tucked tightly into his pocket. The address was burned into his mind, yet he pulled out the card every few minutes just to make sure it was real. The paper felt smooth, crisp, so different from the tattered scraps of newspaper he sometimes used to keep warm on colder nights. His fingers traced the edges as he walked, the weight of his decision pressing down on him with every step. He had agreed to show up. He had agreed to try. But the question still haunted him. Was he actually ready for this? He had spent years on the streets learning to survive with nothing. The idea of having a roof over his head again, of sleeping in a bed instead of on the hard pavement, felt too foreign to grasp. It should have been exciting. It should have filled him with relief, but instead it terrified him. What if he failed? What if he got a taste of something better only to lose it all again? That kind of loss would be worse than never having tried at all. His feet carried him forward step by step toward the unknown. The streets were familiar, yet for the first time in years they felt different. It was not the city that had changed, it was him. He was walking toward something, not just wandering aimlessly, hoping for scraps of luck. It was a strange feeling, unsettling in its unfamiliarity. He clenched his jaw, shoving his hands deeper into his coat pockets. No turning back now. When he reached the address, he stopped outside the building, staring up at it as doubt crept back in. It was a modest structure, nothing like the towering skyscrapers that lined the main streets, but to him, it looked intimidating. The entrance had large glass doors, and through them, he could see people walking through the lobby, dressed in clean clothes, their faces free of the exhaustion he carried in his bones. He did not belong here? Not yet. Maybe not ever. The instinct to turn around hit him hard. His body tensed, his pulse quickened. He had been through this before, offered help, promised opportunities, only to watch them slip through his fingers like sand. He had learned the hard way that the world did not owe him kindness. He had learned that hope was dangerous. Then, his fingers brushed against the card in his pocket. Bill had not forced him to come. He had not given him empty words or false promises. He had simply offered a choice. And for the first time in years, Daniel had chosen something other than survival. He exhaled sharply and stepped forward. The warmth hit him the moment he walked inside. The air smelled of fresh coffee, disinfectant, and something else, something clean, something safe. A receptionist at the front desk looked up, her smile polite but not forced. "Good morning," she greeted, as if he were just another person. not a man who had spent years being ignored. "How can I help you?" For a moment, Daniel forgot how to speak. The words lodged in his throat, stuck between years of silence and uncertainty. Then, forcing himself to push past the hesitation, he pulled the card from his pocket and placed it on the desk. I was told to come here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. The receptionist glanced at the card, then nodded as she typed something into her computer. "Welcome, Daniel," she said, as if she had known he was coming. "We have been expecting you." The words sent a shiver down his spine. Someone had been expecting him. That was new. She gestured toward a hallway to the right. "Please follow me. Mr. Gates left instructions for your arrival." He stiffened. Bill had planned for this? He had actually followed through? That realization alone nearly made his legs give out beneath him. The receptionist led him to a small but comfortable office. Inside, a man in his 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile stood to greet him. He was dressed casually, his presence welcoming rather than intimidating. "Daniel, welcome. My name is Mark. I run this facility." Daniel remained near the door, unsure whether to step inside. His body screamed that this was a trap, a trick, another cruel joke. But there was no hostility in Mark's gaze, no judgment, just quiet understanding. Mark gestured to a chair. "Sit down, if you would like." Hesitantly, Daniel stepped forward and lowered himself onto the seat. The cushion beneath him was soft, the warmth of the room making him even more aware of just how cold he had been outside. Mark leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped together. "You do not have to be here," he said, his tone gentle. "If you are not ready, we are not going to force you into anything. But if you want help, if you want to start rebuilding, then we are here to walk that path with you." Daniel clenched his hands into fists. The fight-or-flight response kicked in hard. His instincts told him to run, to reject this kindness before it could turn to disappointment. But another part of him, the part that had chosen to come here, whispered for him to stay. He swallowed hard. What happens next?" Mark smiled. "We start with the basics. A place to sleep, a chance to clean up, get some warm food, and then when you are ready, we work on the rest. Job training, resources, support, one step at a time." Daniel's throat tightened. It sounded so simple. Too simple. His life had been nothing but chaos for so long that the idea of structure, of stability, felt foreign. "And if I fail?" Mark met his gaze. "Then we try again." The words struck deep. No one had ever said that to him before. His whole life, failure had meant the end. One mistake had cost him everything: his job, his family, his home. He had learned that in the real world, there were no second chances. But now, sitting in this warm room, surrounded by people who were offering him exactly that, he realized something. Maybe it was not the world that refused to give second chances. Maybe he had stopped believing he deserved one. His fingers loosened their grip on his coat. His shoulders, always tense, relaxed just slightly. He exhaled slowly. "Okay," he said, barely above a whisper. "I will try." Mark nodded, his smile widening. "Good. That is all we ask." Daniel did not know what would happen next. He did not know if this would last or if he would mess everything up again. But for the first time in years, he had something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. And that, more than anything, was worth holding on to. Daniel sat in the small, quiet room of the rehabilitation center, staring at the steaming cup of coffee in his hands. The warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the present moment. It had been weeks since he had stepped through the glass doors of this place, uncertain if he belonged, uncertain if he would last. Now, as he took a slow sip of the coffee, he realized something that both terrified and comforted him. He was still here. He had not left. He had not run. For the first time in years, he had a bed to sleep in, clean clothes to wear, and meals that did not come from trash bins or charity handouts. At first, he did not know what to do with himself. The transition had been jarring. The silence of his new room had felt suffocating at first, almost too heavy to bear. He was used to the hum of the streets, the sound of passing cars, distant sirens, the rustling of others who, like him, had made the pavement their home. Here there was structure, order, people who checked in on him, staff members who spoke to him like he was a human being, not an eyesore to be ignored. It had taken time to adjust. The hardest part had not been the routine or even the overwhelming kindness of strangers. It had been facing itself. For years, he had defined himself by his mistakes, by his failures. He had carried the weight of his past on his shoulders, believing that he was beyond redemption. But in this place, there were no labels. No one looked at him with pity or disgust. No one asked him how he had ended up on the streets. They simply asked, "How are you feeling today?" and waited for a real answer. It had taken him days to stop flinching at the kindness, weeks to believe it was real. And now, sitting here, holding a cup of coffee that had not been handed to him out of obligation or guilt, he realized that for the first time in a long time he did not feel invisible. The door to his room opened, pulling him from his thoughts. Mark, the man who had welcomed him on his first day, stepped inside with an easy smile. "You have a visitor," he said, nodding toward the hallway. Daniel's stomach twisted. A visitor? He had no one. No family left. No friends who still cared. The only person who had shown any interest in his existence was... Before he could finish the thought, Mark stepped aside, and Bill Gates walked in. Daniel straightened in his chair, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. Bill looked the same as always, calm, composed, the weight of the world resting on his shoulders, yet somehow never breaking him. There was no pretense in his expression, no expectation, just quiet observation, as if he were assessing how Daniel had changed since the last time they had spoken. Bill glanced around the small but comfortable room before meeting Daniel's gaze. "You are still here," he said simply. Daniel let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "Yeah," he muttered. "Still here." Bill pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. He did not ask about the program, did not ask if Daniel had regrets. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a familiar piece of folded paper. He placed it on the table between them. Daniel's chest tightened. He knew exactly what it was. The first note Bill had given him that night on the street. "I figured you might want this back," Bill said. Daniel hesitated before reaching for it. His fingers traced the creases in the paper, remembering the moment he had first received it. That night, he had been ready to give up. He had thought there was nothing left for him. And then, out of nowhere, someone had stopped. Someone had seen him. "I kept it," Bill continued. "Not because I thought you would need a reminder, but because I wanted you to see how far you have come." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. His grip on the note tightened. He had spent so much time looking at his past with regret, convinced that he had lost everything that made him worth saving. But now, sitting here, staring at the very thing that had changed the course of his life, he realized something he had never considered before. He had not just been given a second chance, he had taken it. "You believed in me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bill's expression softened slightly. "I believe you deserve the chance to believe in yourself." The words hit deep, settling into the cracks that had once felt irreparable. For years, he had defined himself by his failures. But now, for the first time, he saw himself through different eyes. Not as the man who had lost everything, but as the man who had found the strength to rebuild. The conversation moved to lighter things. Bill asked him how he was adjusting, what his next steps were. Daniel admitted he still had no idea what the future looked like, but for the first time, that uncertainty did not terrify him. Mark had spoken to him about job opportunities, training programs, ways to integrate back into the world. He was considering all of them. When their conversation neared its end, Bill stood, adjusting his coat. "I did not come here to check on you," he said. "I came to remind you that this is only the beginning." Daniel nodded, a small, genuine smile pulling at his lips. "I know." Bill extended a hand. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before shaking it, feeling the firm grip of the man who had changed his life with nothing more than a conversation and a choice. As Bill turned to leave, Daniel stared at the note in his hands one last time. Then, carefully, he folded it back up and placed it into his pocket. Not as a reminder of who he had been, but as proof of who he was becoming. That night, for the first time since he had arrived at the center, Daniel found himself standing near the entrance, watching the streets outside. A man sat on the pavement across the road, his head bowed, his hands cupped together, waiting for the kindness of strangers. Daniel hesitated, his pulse quickening as he remembered himself in that same position. The exhaustion, the hopelessness, the feeling that nothing would ever change. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, pulling out a small piece of paper. He unfolded it, staring at the blank surface before taking a deep breath. Then, steady and deliberate, he wrote down 3 simple sentences. "Meet me here tomorrow morning. Let us talk. Daniel." His fingers trembled slightly as he folded the paper and crossed the street. The man barely looked up as Daniel approached. He simply sat there, lost in the same despair Daniel had once known all too well. Daniel knelt down and placed the note beside him. The man's tired eyes flickered with confusion as he glanced at it. "You do not have to believe it right now," Daniel said quietly. "Just hold on to it." And then, without another word, he walked away, leaving the note behind. As he stepped back inside, he realized something profound. The cycle had not ended with him. It had only just begun.